The 6 years of World War II saw air power come of age. Rapid development in aircraft technology produced some of the finest fighter aircraft ever to take to the skies. By the end of the war, the jet age had begun. Aerial combat techniques were formed and refined, and the duels in the sky that took place created many legends. The idea that control of the skies was the only way to win a battle and ultimately a war was proved beyond any doubt. Aerial combat techniques were pioneered during the First World War by biplane scouts over the trenches. It was during this period that the concept of air supremacy was born. Almost 20 years later, the biplane was still the dominant combat aircraft. In the mid-1930s, the Royal Air Force frontline fighter was the Gloster Gladiator. However, the Germans have been developing monoplane fighters, and the most advanced of these was the Messerschmitt 109. With devastating performance and outstanding maneuverability, the 109 first saw combat during the Spanish Civil War, when right-wing military officers, with the support from Nazi Germany, rose up against the socialist government. On the 1st of September 1939, World War II began with the German attack on Poland. The massive ground attack was supported by 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft. As the heavy bombers and dive bombers attacked key targets, the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, who had gained valuable combat experience in the Spanish Civil War, all but destroyed the Polish Air Force with no threat to their ground troops from the skies. 26 days later, Poland was defeated, occupied by both German troops and their allies, the Russians in the east. So began the German blitzing on the rest of mainland Europe. The following few months saw the invasion of the Netherlands and Belgium and the domination of the Luftwaffe in the skies over Europe. Finally, France was defeated. Only the Channel now lay between the might of the German forces and the conquest of Britain. Britain's fighter defense was spearheaded by the legendary Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane. During the summer of 1940, these two aircraft were to become legends in one of the most effective uses of fighter power in history. Hitler was now planning his invasion of Britain. At his disposal was the might of the Luftwaffe, with over 2,500 modern combat aircraft. The strategy was the same as in mainland Europe, to use the Luftwaffe to eliminate Britain's air defenses, paving the way for the planned assault by the German army. Wave after wave of German bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt 109s and 110s, swarmed over the Channel and began attacking shipping in order to test Britain's air defenses. The famous Ju-87 Stuka, the most effective dive bomber ever produced, wreaked havoc on shipping in the English Channel. Britain had an elaborate chain of radar stations to warn of incoming attacks, and these were linked to command centres that would guide the British fighters to their targets. The Battle of Britain, as it was christened, had begun. The Luftwaffe had an overwhelming numerical superiority over the RAF, whose fighter command could only muster 36 squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires. Soon, their pilots were being scrambled several times a day to engage the Luftwaffe in furious air battles. The dogfights in the skies over Britain were clearly visible from the ground as the Germans and British fighter pilots battled to the death in the air. Both sides suffered heavy losses and were stretched to breaking point.
A 109 destroyed, buddy, yes.
Oh, good show. How'd you get on, sir?
I had a wonderful party, thanks.
Are you all right? You get any of the batters?
Yes, I got a Messerschmitt 109 and a Dornier.
Towards the end of August, the Luftwaffe stepped up their attacks and mounted a round-the-clock offensive to exhaust the RAF. The British placed the highest priority on protecting their airfields. The fighters were told to concentrate on attacking the German bombers and avoid unnecessary dogfights. RAF pilots were often in combat 5 or 6 times a day. This was taking its toll, and the strain was beginning to show. Although the Luftwaffe was suffering heavy losses, their attacks were having an effect. An enormous amount of damage had been done to the airfields. The RAF was perilously close to defeat. But despite their exhaustion, British pilots remained defiant as they took an increasing toll of German bombers. The Germans prepared for invasion. The raids continued as time and again the British fighter pilots scrambled to meet the incoming German bombers both by day and by night. on September the 7th, radar reports began to come in of massive German bomber formations. All of Britain knew that invasion was imminent. It looked as if this was to be the day. Winston Churchill declared, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." But it soon became clear that the raid was heading towards London. Damage and civilian casualties were severe. However, the vital airfields remained relatively untouched. The Germans had committed a fatal tactical error. By switching the attacks to London, Hitler had expected that Britain would attempt to reach a peaceful settlement. But the RAF had been given much-needed time to regroup. A week later, it was able to inflict massive damage on the incoming Luftwaffe bombers. Hitler postponed the invasion until further notice. The Battle of Britain had been won. In its darkest hour, Britain had survived. Just a few hundred pilots and their support crews, along with the radar and control systems operators, had held the mighty Luftwaffe at bay. British air power had prevented the German invasion. Winston Churchill summed up the debt owed by the nation to her aircrew. Never, in the field of human conflict, was so much owed by so many to so few. Hitler now turned his attention to the Soviet Union, former allies of the Germans. In June 1941, a massive blitzkrieg offensive codenamed Operation Barbarossa was launched across a front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The attack caught the Russians almost completely by surprise. Over 1,200 Soviet aircraft were lost on the first day alone. The powerful Me-109s tore through the Soviet air defenses and cleared the skies for the German armies to rapidly advance across the Western Soviet Union. Their advance appeared to be unstoppable, the German troops steadily crossing the Soviet Union. The Soviet Polikarpov aircraft were outdated and proved to be no match for the Messerschmitt 109s. The massacre in the air continued, with the Soviets losing thousands more aircraft. The Luftwaffe pilots in their 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dominated the skies over the Soviet Union. Defeat seemed inevitable. However, the Germans were halted just outside Moscow, not by the Russians, but by the harsh Soviet winter. Hitler's plans had once again been thwarted. Barbarossa was over. The Germans were stalled on the brink of victory by the weather. The pause gave the Soviets time to regroup. In December 1941, the Soviets started their counter-offensive using more modern Yak-1 and MiG-3 aircraft. Slowly, the Germans were pushed back, and the battle for the Soviet Union entered a new phase. In July 1943, the Germans started a major offensive on the central area of the Eastern Front in order to break the deadlock that had occurred. The Soviets had a large presence around Kursk, and as the Germans attacked, the largest air battles in history took place. The more modern Soviet Yaks and Lavochkins were augmented by fighters sent from the United States. These included the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Now the Soviets had aircraft that were the equal of the German 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. The tough, reliable Soviet machines, flown by extremely capable and aggressive Soviet pilots, turned the tide in the skies over the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe lost more than 900 aircraft. The Soviet pilots were spurred on by the enormous casualties that had been taking place on the ground and in the air. Their attacks on the Germans were ferocious. The ferocious tank battle that was taking place on the ground was one of the largest in history. When the German panzer assault seemed to be on the verge of victory, Sturmovik ground attack fighters supported a Soviet counterattack which drove the Germans back. German tanks and transport vehicles were decimated as the Soviets pressed eastwards. The battle at Kursk had been won by a combination of Soviet tanks on the ground and fighters and ground attack fighters in the skies. The support of air power was once again proving to be devastating. The United States Air Force began arriving in England in the summer of 1943. Their strategy was to launch large daylight raids on strategic targets over occupied Europe and into Germany itself. Early raids, such as the ball bearing works at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, where over 120 aircraft were lost in 2 raids, saw heavy losses to the bombers, even though the heavily defended aircraft were thought to be well enough protected. The only answer was escort fighters. To begin with, Spitfires and P-47 Thunderbolts could only escort the bombers part of the way to the target. The P-47 hadn't been designed as an escort fighter, and it didn't have the range to escort the bombers all the way into Germany. The introduction of drop tanks improved the range, and by the end of the summer of 1943, they were becoming increasingly effective. The unusual twin-boom design of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning earned it the nickname the Fork-tailed Devil. It proved to be an enormously capable bomber escort with enough range to carry it into the heart of Europe. But the best known and most decisive long-range escort fighter was the legendary P-51 Mustang. Originally developed for the RAF, the Mustang evolved into a fighter that could escort bombers right into the very heart of Germany. Its superb performance equaled and in some cases bettered the latest German fighters. When a return attack was launched on Schweinfurt, fighters escorted the bombers during the entire raid and only 11 aircraft were lost. Bomber crews christened these escorts as their little friends. The combination of the escort fighters and the bombers' own defenses proved incredibly effective, and the destruction of the German war machine moved up a gear. The Luftwaffe were taking heavy losses as the war in Europe entered its final phase. With the Allied fighters rapidly clearing the skies of Luftwaffe fighters, the bombers became increasingly effective over their targets. The duels in the skies had captured the public's imagination around the world, and many high-scoring fighter aces were paraded in public to boost morale. Among these were Adolf Galland, who eventually scored 104 victories. And Francis Gaby Gabreski, who was one of the top-scoring American aces in Europe. The Allies returned to France during the Normandy landings in 1944 had the support of over 12,000 aircraft. The fighters roamed the skies, engaging any German fighter opposition, while the bombers and fighter bombers attacked key strategic targets. This left the troops on the ground free from the threat of attack from the air. As the Allies broke out at Normandy and began the liberation of Europe, the Luftwaffe were forced back to defend their homeland. The Luftwaffe pilots now had to fight for Germany's very survival. The defense of the Reich had begun. The German pilots fought using their traditional skill. German pilots, unlike their Allied counterparts, didn't have a limited tour of duty. Instead, they flew continuously with only death or injury to end their tour. The latest developments of the 109 and 190 were joined by the jet-powered Messerschmitt 262 as well as the rocket-powered ME 163. Allied ground attack aircraft flew virtually unchallenged over occupied Europe, wreaking devastation on the German war machine. Over the skies of Germany, the defenders fought, but despite some successes, the end was in sight for the Third Reich. Final defeat came in May 1945. The once mighty Luftwaffe had been defeated. Air power had proved to be a decisive element in many of the campaigns and in many instances turned the tide of the war. Aircraft such as the Mustang and the Spitfire had played a vital part in the victory over the Nazis. Then, as today, the aircraft technology and the skill of the pilots remain the key to winning the fight for the skies.